What you see in terms of child development, language acquisition is one very clear phenomenon, which is right at the beginning of life, a kid can learn any single language out there. There are hundreds and hundreds of different vowel sounds in different languages, even more consonant sounds, and any kid can learn any language. And what you see in a child in 1 to 3 months of age is roughly equal response to any phonemes, any sounds that are building blocks of language. And what development is from there is you lose that ability. As you begin to acquire your own, you start being unable to hear the difference between other sounds, and suddenly you're back to taking biopsies out of bears instead of pears, depending on what language you're in. As you acquire your own language, virtually by definition, in acquiring it, you are losing the capacity to hear vast amounts of phonemic subtlety from all the other languages. By 3 months of age, kids are already beginning to preferentially pay attention to spoken language rather than nonsense syllables. They are already beginning to note structure of language in terms of what they pay attention to. By 3 to 6 months of age, they're already preferentially paying attention to vowel sounds. They're beginning to learn that sounds are broken up. They're beginning to do that statistical relationship stuff of combinations of sounds. Somewhere by about 8, 9 months of age, babbling starts. And again, that business about babbling during sign language, that's showing that. What you also see is when kids start babbling, they tend to have stronger facial expressions on the right side of their face. That same argument about the left hemisphere beginning to take some control over stuff. What else? By 9 months of age, kids are beginning to recognize structures, word combinations in terms of responding to them. They are beginning to have lost an awful lot of their ability to pick up phonemes from other languages. By about 11 months of age, they're beginning to generate the typical vowels, consonants of their language, and out of that pops language soon afterward. Okay, so a feature of language acquisition in humans, which is pretty bizarre, is that adult members of our species sit around and invest huge amounts of energy in a one-on-one level to, in an intentional, premeditated manner, help youngins acquire the communication of the species. We do directed teaching of language. And this is unique. And it turns out this is not what is found in most cultures on this planet. In most of them, kids pick up language purely by observation, by hearing, by being witnessed to. It is a relatively recent westernized invention, I don't know, maybe in the last 1,000 years or so, where you sit down children and you generate simple examples of the language, which you present in a repetitive way, simple versions of words, of grammar, where you direct it towards them and where you then correct their attempts at repeating it. That's a relatively new invention. And bizarrely enough, it's not entirely clear if that accelerates language acquisition, which would be a real drag after everyone being tortured with phonics back when or some such thing. This is a relatively new hominid invention. It is relatively rare culturally, and it's not so clear if it actually accomplishes a whole lot. Now, part of what you also find with kids beginning to not be able to discriminate between two different sounds in some, what will prove to be another language other than the one they're learning, that begins to be, when you're doing imaging there, that Wernicke's is not distinguishing between the two sounds in terms of its activation pattern. That's where you're beginning to lose the ability to hear universality of language sounds and instead begin to focus in on your own. What else do you see? Second languages. Where do second languages fit in with this? And there are all sorts of critical periods of development with it as to when it comes in. One of the ones that everybody knows is if you learn a language anytime after roughly age 12 or so, most typically you will never be able to speak it without an accent for the rest of your life. That seems to be one of the landmarks, exceptions, blah, blah, the usual. Nonetheless, that seems to be generally the pattern. What about brain coding for a second language? What is found is if you get a second language before roughly 6 years of age, essentially if you are growing up bilingual, both languages are coded in very overlapping regions of Wernicke's and Broca's. how can you see that? Because you get individuals, when they have a stroke, will get, for example, a comprehension aphasia in both of the languages that they are native speakers of, that they grew up with. Learn a language after 6, and what you typically see is the Wernicke's area that does the second language tends to be a more peripheral area. And likewise, what's activating in Broke is you're not getting the center seats, you're not getting the orchestra seats for where you're doing the second language if it's coming in later. And thus you can get the truly bizarre cases of people who get a very selective stroke and will lose one language and not the other. So you begin to get that there. What accents are about, what the critical period is on accents, God knows, but you have that coming in there by around age 12 or so.